Pure mathematics as an act of beauty, not utility, was not just a philosophical position for G.H. Hardy, it was the foundation of his identity and the lens through which he judged both his work and his life. To understand Hardy, one must first understand that he did not see mathematics as a servant of the world. He saw it as a form of art, comparable to poetry or music, where the value lies not in what it can do, but in what it is. This belief placed him at odds with a society that increasingly demanded usefulness, efficiency, and measurable outcomes from every intellectual effort. For Hardy, beauty in mathematics came from structure, elegance, and inevitability. A beautiful proof was one that felt necessary, as if it could not possibly be otherwise. It did not rely on brute force or excessive calculation, but on insight and harmony. In this sense, pure mathematics was timeless. Unlike machines, technologies, or applied theories, a beautiful theorem did not age. It existed outside history, untouched by political change or social fashion. Hardy found comfort in this permanence. In a world that was unstable and often cruel, pure mathematics offered him certainty and order. Utility, in contrast, made Hardy deeply uncomfortable. Useful mathematics, by definition, could be applied, and what is applied can be misused. Living through an era marked by world wars, Hardy watched mathematics become a tool of destruction. Equations guided artillery fire, statistics optimized warfare, and abstract theories were transformed into weapons. Hardy felt a moral revulsion toward this process. He did not want his intellectual labor to contribute, even indirectly, to human suffering. By valuing uselessness, he believed he was protecting mathematics from moral corruption. A theorem with no application could harm no one. This view led Hardy to draw a sharp line between pure and applied mathematics. Applied mathematics, in his eyes, was bound to the physical world and its problems. It was temporary, contingent, and ultimately replaceable. Pure mathematics, however, dealt with ideas that were internally complete. It did not depend on experiments or observations. Its truths were absolute once proven. Hardy believed that this separation was essential to preserve the dignity of mathematics. To blur the line was to reduce mathematics to mere engineering. Hardy's emphasis on beauty also shaped how he judged mathematical greatness. He did not admire work simply because it was difficult or powerful. He admired it because it was elegant. A single page of insight was worth more than volumes of calculation. This attitude made him suspicious of trends that valued technical complexity over conceptual clarity. For Hardy, complexity without beauty was a sign of failure, not success. Mathematics, like art, should reveal simplicity beneath apparent chaos. This aesthetic commitment also explains Hardy's intense fear of aging. Beauty, in his view, was closely linked to creativity, and creativity was tied to youth. He believed that the capacity to produce beautiful mathematics declined sharply with age. As his own creative powers faded, Hardy felt that his connection to beauty was being severed. This was not merely professional anxiety. It was existential terror. If mathematics was his art, and art was his reason for living, then the loss of creative ability meant the loss of meaning itself. Hardy's celebration of beauty also influenced his relationship with Srinivasa Ramanujan. What struck Hardy most about Ramanujan was not just his originality, but the natural beauty of his ideas. Ramanujan produced formulas that seemed to emerge fully formed, without effort or explanation. To Hardy, this was the highest form of mathematical artistry. Yet this admiration was mixed with tension. Hardy insisted on rigorous proof, while Ramanujan often relied on intuition. This clash revealed a deeper question: is beauty enough, or must beauty submit to formal discipline? Hardy struggled with this question, torn between his aesthetic ideals and his commitment to logical purity. Ironically, Hardy's belief in uselessness did not survive history. The very areas of mathematics he prized for their purity, especially number theory, later became central to cryptography and digital security. Ideas once considered abstract curiosities now protect financial systems and global communications. This transformation exposes the tragic irony of Hardy's position. Beauty, once discovered, cannot be confined. The world eventually finds a use for it, whether the creator wishes it or not. Hardy wanted to believe that beauty could remain untouched, but reality proved otherwise. Yet this irony does not invalidate Hardy's vision. Instead, it highlights its fragility. Hardy understood something profound, that when usefulness becomes the sole measure of value, beauty is endangered. A society that asks only, "What is it good for?" risks losing the deeper question, "Is it true, and is it beautiful?" Hardy's defense of pure mathematics was ultimately a defense of human creativity itself. He was arguing for a space where the mind could operate freely, without justification or external demand. In A Mathematician's Apology, Hardy presents this view with quiet urgency. The book is often read as a celebration of pure mathematics, but it is also a confession of vulnerability. Hardy is defending his life choices against a world that might see them as impractical or selfish. He insists that beauty is enough, because without beauty, life itself becomes mechanical and empty. Mathematics, for him, was not a career. It was a way of asserting that the human mind can create meaning independent of power and profit. The tragedy lies in the cost of this belief. By rejecting utility, Hardy isolated himself from the broader world. When beauty faded from his reach, he had nothing to replace it. His devotion to pure mathematics gave his life extraordinary clarity, but it also left him exposed. Pure mathematics was his sanctuary, but it demanded total loyalty. In choosing beauty over utility, Hardy achieved intellectual purity, but he paid for it with loneliness and despair. Ultimately, Hardy's idea of pure mathematics as an act of beauty challenges us to reconsider our own values. It asks whether we can honor work that exists simply because it is beautiful, not because it is useful. Hardy's life suggests that such devotion is both noble and dangerous. Beauty can elevate the human spirit, but when it becomes the only source of meaning, its loss can be devastating. The inner conflict between intellectual brilliance and emotional isolation defined G.H. Hardy's life as deeply as his mathematical achievements. While the world saw him as a towering intellect, Hardy experienced himself as increasingly alone, trapped within the very brilliance that made him exceptional. His tragedy was not simply that he was misunderstood by society, but that his devotion to thought gradually narrowed his emotional world until mathematics became both his companion and his barrier to human connection. Hardy lived almost entirely in his mind. From a young age, his identity fused with his intellect. Mathematics was not something he did, it was who he was. This fusion brought extraordinary clarity and focus, but it also came at a cost. Emotional life, with its uncertainties, compromises, and vulnerabilities, felt distracting and even threatening. Hardy preferred the precision of ideas to the unpredictability of relationships. In mathematics, truth could be proven. In human connection, nothing was guaranteed. This preference was not merely temperament, it became a form of self-protection. Emotional attachment creates the risk of loss, disappointment, and dependence. Hardy, who valued control and order, found such risks intolerable. He maintained distance from others, keeping his personal life carefully insulated. Friendships existed, but rarely crossed into intimacy. His world was composed of colleagues, correspondence, and abstract thought, rather than emotional closeness. Yet brilliance does not erase the human need for connection. Hardy's isolation was not a peaceful solitude. It was a tension he carried quietly. He admired beauty and creativity, but struggled to share his inner life. Mathematics gave him a language of expression, but it could not replace emotional reciprocity. As long as his intellect was productive, this imbalance remained hidden. Creation filled the emotional vacuum. Discovery acted as both achievement and anesthesia. The arrival of Srinivasa Ramanujan exposed this inner conflict more clearly than any other event in Hardy's life. Ramanujan was not only a mathematical prodigy, but also a deeply emotional and intuitive thinker. Their collaboration was intense and transformative. For Hardy, Ramanujan represented a rare meeting of minds, a connection that went beyond routine academic exchange. In guiding and supporting Ramanujan, Hardy stepped closer to emotional involvement than he had ever allowed himself. This closeness, however, was uneasy. Hardy's emotional restraint clashed with Ramanujan's vulnerability. While Hardy focused on proofs and structure, Ramanujan carried homesickness, illness, and spiritual belief. Hardy cared for him, but often in an intellectualized way. He struggled to meet emotional needs directly, translating concern into mentorship and discipline. When Ramanujan's health deteriorated and his life ended prematurely, Hardy was left with a burden of guilt and unresolved grief. His brilliance had guided him, but it had also limited his emotional response. As Hardy aged, the conflict between brilliance and isolation intensified. He believed that mathematical creativity belonged to the young, and as his powers declined, so did his sense of worth. Without active creation, the intellectual identity that had justified his isolation began to collapse. Mathematics had been his shield against loneliness. Now the shield was cracking. The silence left behind was no longer peaceful, but oppressive. In this later stage of life, Hardy's isolation became more visible. He had built few emotional structures outside his work, and now there was little to support him. Intellectual admiration from others could not replace intimacy. Recognition did not ease loneliness. The very qualities that had made him great, discipline, detachment, intellectual purity, now deepened his despair. His brilliance, once a source of pride, became a reminder of what he had lost. Hardy's writings from this period reveal a man wrestling with emptiness. A mathematician's apology is often read as a defense of pure mathematics, but beneath its rational tone lies a cry of vulnerability. Hardy is not only justifying mathematics, he is justifying his life. He is asking whether a life devoted almost entirely to intellect can still be considered meaningful when the intellect begins to fail. The book exposes how deeply his self-worth depended on his brilliance. This dependence highlights the core of Hardy's tragedy. He had allowed intellectual achievement to replace emotional integration. Rather than balancing thought with connection, he had chosen depth in one dimension at the expense of the other. This choice gave him greatness, but it also narrowed his humanity. When brilliance faded, there was no emotional foundation strong enough to compensate. Hardy's story reveals a broader truth about exceptional intellect. Brilliance can isolate not only because others cannot follow it, but because the brilliant individual may retreat into it. Intellect becomes a fortress, protecting against confusion and pain, but also blocking warmth and intimacy. Over time, the walls grow thicker and escape becomes harder. Hardy did not simply end up isolated. He slowly constructed that isolation through disciplined devotion to thought. Yet it would be unfair to see Hardy as emotionally cold or indifferent. His isolation was not a lack of feeling, but a difficulty in expressing and managing it. He felt deeply, but he trusted ideas more than emotions. When emotions could not be translated into structure, he withdrew. His tragedy lies in this imbalance, not in cruelty or arrogance. The inner conflict between intellectual brilliance and emotional isolation ultimately left Hardy in a painful paradox. His mind reached extraordinary heights, but his emotional life remained constrained. The world admired his intellect, but rarely saw his vulnerability. In choosing brilliance as his primary mode of existence, Hardy gained clarity and lost comfort. His life stands as a powerful reminder that the human spirit needs more than ideas to survive. It needs connection, meaning, and emotional presence, things that even the most beautiful mathematics cannot fully replace. Tragedy born from a world that values usefulness over timeless thought is the final and perhaps deepest layer of G.H. Hardy's story. Hardy did not simply suffer as an individual, he suffered as a symbol of a vanishing ideal. He lived at a moment when society was rapidly redefining the worth of knowledge. Ideas were no longer judged by their truth or beauty alone, but by their capacity to produce measurable results. In such a world, Hardy's devotion to timeless thought placed him in quiet but irreversible conflict with the direction of modern civilization. Hardy believed that the highest intellectual achievements should exist independently of practical demands. To him, timeless thought was valuable precisely because it resisted immediate application. It belonged to a realm beyond politics, economics, and war. This belief was not naive, it was ethical. Hardy understood that once knowledge becomes useful, it becomes vulnerable to exploitation. The 20th century proved him right. Scientific and mathematical ideas were increasingly absorbed into systems of power, industry, and military force. The more useful an idea became, the more likely it was to be weaponized. The modern world, however, had little patience for such concerns. Nations demanded innovation, universities rewarded application, funding followed results, knowledge was reorganized around productivity. In this environment, pure thinkers like Hardy appeared increasingly anachronistic. They could be admired, but not fully justified. Their work could be tolerated, but not prioritized. Hardy sensed this shift acutely. Even when he was celebrated, he felt out of place, as if he belonged to an older moral universe that was slowly disappearing. This tension shaped Hardy's public and private anxieties. He feared that mathematics itself was being transformed from an art into an instrument. What had once been a contemplative pursuit was becoming a means to an end. Hardy resisted this change not because he feared progress, but because he feared reduction. To reduce thought to usefulness was to strip it of its dignity. In a purely utilitarian framework, ideas exist only to serve external goals. Hardy believed that such a framework impoverished the human spirit. The tragedy lies in the fact that Hardy's resistance could not stop history. The world moved forward, and usefulness became the dominant measure of value. Even worse, the mathematics Hardy loved most eventually found powerful applications. Number theory, once the purest example of useless beauty, became central to cryptography and digital systems. The timeless ideas Hardy believed to be morally safe were absorbed into the very technological world he mistrusted. This development turned his ethical stance into a painful irony. For Hardy, This was not a victory but a loss. It meant that no intellectual territory was immune. The world would eventually claim everything. Beauty could be discovered, but it could not be protected. The idea that pure thought could remain untouched by power was revealed as an illusion. This realization deepened Hardy's sense of futility. If even the most abstract ideas could be converted into tools, then the sanctuary he had devoted his life to was no longer secure. Hardy's personal tragedy mirrored this broader cultural shift. As the world valued usefulness more aggressively, Hardy's own value became increasingly fragile. He measured his worth through creative contribution, not through service or application. When age diminished his creative power, he found himself unable to adapt to a system that rewarded productivity in practical terms. The modern world offered no meaningful role for a pure thinker who could no longer produce new beauty. This sense of obsolescence was devastating. Hardy did not fear death as much as he feared uselessness. In a world obsessed with outcomes, to be unproductive was to be invisible. Hardy's despair was intensified by the fact that he had deliberately rejected other forms of value. He had not built a life around family, material success, or public service. His entire existence had been justified by timeless thought. When the world no longer honored that justification, he was left exposed. A mathematician's apology can be read as Hardy's final confrontation with this reality. The book is often described as a defense of pure mathematics, but it is also an indictment of a world that no longer understands why such a defense is necessary. Hardy is not simply explaining mathematics. He is pleading for a different way of valuing human effort. He argues that ideas can be worth pursuing even if they change nothing in the material world. In doing so, he challenges the moral assumptions of modern society. The tragedy is not that Hardy lost this argument, but that the argument itself became marginalized. Modern culture increasingly equates value with impact, influence, and scalability. Timeless thought, by its nature, resists these metrics. It does not scale, it does not perform, it simply exists. Hardy's life demonstrates how difficult it is to sustain such a position in a world that demands justification for everything. Yet Hardy's tragedy also contains a warning. A civilization that values only usefulness risks losing its soul. When all knowledge is treated as a means to an end, there is no space left for contemplation, wonder, or beauty. Hardy's suffering exposes the human cost of this imbalance. His despair was not merely personal, it was philosophical. It arose from living in a world that no longer made room for the kind of meaning he believed in. In the end, Hardy stands as a tragic figure not because he was wrong, but because he was early, and perhaps alone, in recognizing the consequences of a purely utilitarian world view. His life asks whether a society can truly flourish if it honors only what is useful and neglects what is timeless. Hardy paid a heavy price for choosing timeless thought over worldly relevance. His story reminds us that progress without reflection can leave even the greatest minds behind, and that usefulness, when made absolute, can become a form of quiet cruelty.